Shell, like many of its peer group companies, has an established reputation for advancing the interests of its industry, advancing the interests of engineering, for example. But it's also hit the news headlines for doggedly pursuing commercial imperatives in order to ensure success. How does a passionate engineer balance those kind of competing demands within a multinational corporate environment?
Well, one example comes to mind, and it's around the safety cases and the design classes we have for our facilities. It is possible to put in a multitude of safety barriers in any design. And it's also enticing to think that with every barrier, one is gaining an additional level of safety. The reality, however, is that sometimes more barriers can actually create a system that is more complex and actually ends up being less safe as a system than another design. Now, the language we use is to get risks to a point which is as low as reasonably practicable, a LARP. And it's a mantra that we use, and is one which engineers, particularly when they come into the industry, do have to spend some time getting their arms around. And it can be seen initially as this is purely a design versus cost. And actually, as one goes into the subject, you quickly see that it all comes down to the integrity of a system as a whole. Cost is just a consequence, but the paramount thing is the integrity of the system as a whole. And that's very illuminating for engineers. And it's also illuminating to see that actually in an area where they would have thought that things would have been in conflict, actually they are not.
You focused a spotlight on cross-sector leadership, the ability to develop skills to enable a business leader to lead also in the public sector. You've gone and experienced public sector leadership, public sector challenges yourself. I wonder if you feel that for today's environment and the challenges that arise in the contemporary context, that a new culture of leadership is essential.
I would argue that they have to be more uniquely the same. For the simple reason that to transform a society, and to do that through public enterprise, requires clarity of vision. It requires an attention to the tactical plan of delivery, and it requires doing that in collaboration with others. I mean, these are three things which are common, and they're easy to say and very difficult to do. In that respect, that common leadership needs to be equal across both industry and public sector. There are some things that can get in the way, I think. There may be a belief system, perhaps in the public space, that things cannot progress at a certain pace, or that things cannot progress unless all the questions have been answered initially. And that things can actually progress when there isn't a clarity on what the return on investment is. I exaggerate for effect, and I could say the converse of industry. We need to challenge that. We need to challenge that for the simple reason that for what we're speaking of, both public and private sector need to have a common view on what needs to happen. If we're speaking of grand infrastructure, or if we're speaking of the grand project, which is our children and their capability, and how we foster that, and how every party plays their role in that, we need to be completely joined up. And we need to be absolutely comfortable that when we begin that, there are some things that won't be known. We have to be absolutely sure with each other that we know that all of our efforts, regardless of their significance, that the returns will be multiples of it. And hence we shouldn't limit our aspiration of how much effort we put into that particular space. If we do these things, then I'm sure we'll have a good outcome.
You've been in global business for 30 years. How do you see changes in the energy industry, in the technology sector?
30 years ago, energy was highly centralized. Large centers of production with a very wide and extensive distribution network, and with a few players. Contrast with today, there are many players. Energy has become much more distributed in its generation, and it's become much more micro. It's become much more to the dimensions of cities and villages, and looking at energy solutions in combined heat and power that can service that, as opposed to the large centralized view that we had in the past. Also, in oil and gas, all of those elephant fields by and large have been discovered. Every now and then we're lucky and we find another. But the technology has moved on to take advantage of the more marginal plays. And so in Shell, we have a wonderful thing in construction called floating LNG, and it's a large barge. It's nearly 0.5 kilometre long and has a processing plant on top. And this barge will go over small gas fields that traditionally we would have said was a stranded pocket of gas. It would have been too costly to put a pipeline there. And we will extract that gas, liquefy it, and then be able to deliver it to ships that come alongside and take it away. You know, that kind of play was not really conceivable years ago. The shale gas revolution that we've seen in the US has been enabled through technology and technology developments over years. Again, that was a resource which people thought was uneconomic many years ago, and has made many more provinces much more viable and part of this energy mix and energy solution space. So the diversity and richness has increased tremendously, as has, of course, the technology that's accompanied it, and the way that that technology, by and large, hasn't been developed by oil and gas majors. It's actually been developed by many partners who are active in the supply chain. And so it's wonderful to see how these technology developments are very broad. And so certainly today, collaborative innovation is the language of our current currency, and it comes from the most unexpected of places sometimes.